All right. So welcome everyone. For this session on populism and illiberalism, we have a session with two very interesting guests. I'm really looking forward to their presentations. Jasmin König from the University of Hamburg and Michael Jankowski from the University of Oldenburg. And our session is about populism and illiberalism, and of course that relates to the question of democracy. And our first paper will be presented by Jasmin, and she talks about the relationship between populist governments and unconstitutional policy proposals or policies. And that's on the party level, so to speak, or the country level. And then we'll move to the paper by Michael, which is on the individual level, looking at whether populist voters are more supportive of liberal attitudes. I'm not gonna do their presentations, they're gonna do so much more, but thank you for coming. So obviously we're doing this in the context of the populism seminar, a seminar organized by Annika Werner, André Zaslav, Robert Huber, and me. And yeah, we hope that this is an outlet for researchers, experienced researchers, but also, let's say, early career researchers to share their work and also get feedback. So really do not hesitate to give feedback and to ask questions. So this meeting is being recorded. I think you also heard that message. That means if you cannot open your camera, so you won't be visible, but you can ask your question by raising your hand, and then you can also open your microphone. Then your voice will be recorded. You can also ask your question through the Q&A panel. It's not the chat function, but the Q&A, and that works really well as well. And then we can ask the question. Yeah, so I would say without much more further ado, we give the floor to Jasmin, and I'll stop my presentation so you can start sharing yours.
Thank you so much. One second, I'll share the presentation right now, and I hope you're able to see it now.
Yeah, I see it. I see it, and I'm gonna stop my video so we only see you. So you'll be talking into the void, but we'll still be there. So don't worry.
All right. Thank you so much for the nice introduction and for the possibility to present here today. Our paper is called "Do Populist Governments Produce Unconstitutional Policies?" and it works with evidence from Austria between 1980 and 2020, and it's joint work with Tilko Svalve from the University of Hanover. A little bit about our motivation behind this paper. Increasingly more often we see populists in power. And in some of these cases, we see severe attacks on judicial independence. But not in all of these countries where populists are in power. They do have these sweeping majorities for constitutional reform or to restaff the court or to change the competencies of the court. So we wondered, what if they don't have these majorities? Do they just transgress constitutional boundaries instead? That is why our paper is called, asks the question, do governments, including a populist junior coalition partner, legislate more unconstitutional laws? We build our theory on two strands of research. One is that populism clashes with the pluralist elements of constitutional democracy, and the other is the inclusion moderation hypothesis, which states that including populists into government will tame them. We work with data from the Austrian Constitutional Court between 1980 and 2020, and we estimate our results using a logistic regression. About our first argument, that constitutionalism and populism are in awe with one another. Why should we even expect that populists would prefer to transgress constitutional boundaries more often? Well, constitutionalism, at least in our liberal understanding, is pluralist. It implements counter-majoritarian institutions such as constitutional courts, and it restricts policymaking. So there are three reasons to expect that populists would now transgress these constitutional boundaries. One is that they share a different democratic ideal than liberal constitutionalism. They share the democratic ideal of popular sovereignty without any constraints. So they think that the only legitimate input into the policy-making process is the homogeneous general will of the people. If now the populist voters share these populist attitudes and they actually think the same, the populist parties don't have to be afraid of a public backlash. So why all governments would like to transgress constitutional boundaries from time to time, but why they often don't do it is because they're scared of the voters. They're scared of a backlash. Populist parties don't really have to be that scared of this backlash if their voters agree with what they think about the Constitutional Court and the Constitution. And last but not least, we think that at least right-wing populist parties share preferences outside the constitutional scope more often. Just think, for example, about asylum seekers and the demand to take basic rights away from them, which we hear from different populist parties quite often. So all in all, we think that there's less incentives for populists to comply with the Constitution. But on the other hand, there's the inclusion moderation theory, which states that including populists into government will tame them. So that's kind of a contradiction to our first expectation. So the argument behind this is that populists need to moderate to be considered as a coalition partner in the first step. If they then join a government, they will need to compromise with their coalition partners, and they need to prove that they can deliver public goods. The evidence so far is mostly based on manifestos, rhetoric, and communication. Only a few studies found this moderating effect. Most studies did not find evidence in support of the inclusion moderation thesis. One of those papers was presented here last semester by Jakob Schwörer. So what our argument is now is that rhetoric and communication are very different from policies, because rhetoric and communication are directed at the populist voter, while policies are directly related to delivering public goods. And with agreeing on policies, you can signal to your coalition partner that you're still interested in actually governing with them. So we think that the effect behind the inclusion moderation thesis should be stronger in case of policies than communication. So this, of course, is something that relates to this idea of 1 foot in, 1 foot out the door, which Albertazzi described, where populists kind of try to do it both ways, to be governing and the opposition in government. So they could use rhetoric and communication to signal to their voters, at the same time signal to their coalition partners by agreeing on policies. So it's actually great for them to solve the problem of being an anti-elitist party in government. But of course, the problem is now that it's kind of hard to measure policies. We can do this well if we look at a case study and do this qualitatively, which is really important as well. But we wanted to look at this with a little bit more data. So we wondered, how can we measure these policy shifts? And we operationalize this way, that we use constitutional court decisions as a measurement of policy shifts. So we argue that if populists translate their agenda, so their preferences to transgress constitutional boundaries more often than other parties, into legislative action, we should see a rise in constitutional repeals. On the other hand, if populists are tamed, and this is what we expect, because we expect that the inclusion moderation hypothesis does have an effect on policies, then we should see no change in the frequency of constitutional repeals. So what we are looking here for is a zero effect, actually. We look at this in the case of Austria, which of course is a prominent example of populist government participation. FPÖ and BZÖ, who were in government there, are prototypical examples of right-wing populism. The participation is spread evenly across our time frame, as you can see here, and that is quite important to us to see that the results are not driven by one government. And most importantly, Austria has an independent constitutional court, which is not scared of populists in power. And that, of course, is very important for our operationalization. To do this way, we need a constitutional court that is not scared of repealing laws which a populist party has decided with their government. And that, of course, is not the case in all countries where populist parties are in office. So that was one of the reasons why we chose Austria. Just a real quick excursion. is there any reason that we would expect FPÖ and BZÖ to have preferences outside the constitutional scope, to have preferences for transgressing constitutional boundaries? There's quite a bit. I'm just gonna go into a few. So they tried to restrict basic rights of asylum seekers or demanded it again and again, while in government, while in opposition, it didn't really matter, but it's a major topic for them, of course. They questioned the European Convention of Human Rights quite often, which is constitutional in Austria, so it's part of the Austrian constitution by now. And I think a quote that puts it very well is the one by Kickel from 2019, where he said that the law should follow politics and politics shouldn't follow the law. And I think that describes it quite well, that they don't really share any preferences to follow the constitution nor constitutional court decisions. We collected a novel data set to do this analysis. It includes all Austrian Constitutional Court decisions between 1980 and 2020. In all, it's 3,000 laws under review, and we include information on the decision that was taken. We link the law under review to a government. We include information on the policy area, and we have further information on plaintiffs, catchwords, and whether the law was a federal or state law. Of course, to make this possible, we need to be able to look at some laws that were passed. And that, of course, is only possible if they did decide on laws from time to time. So we can see here that they did this. There's a little bit fewer laws in the time where populists were in power, but they did decide on enough laws for our analysis to work. We operationalize this the way that we have a dependent variable, which is a dummy variable. If a law was held constitutional, it's 0. If a law was invalidated, it's 1. Our independent variable is the share of departments occupied by populists. We do this way so we can account for the different strength of the populist party in the government over time. We include policy areas, migration, security policies, and social policies. Because of course it might be that they just transgress constitutional boundaries in policy areas of particular importance to them. And we check this by using interaction effects between populism and the policy areas. I have more info about the controls, but I'll leave that for the questions if you're interested. And we estimate our results using a logistic regression. So now remember, if the inclusion moderation hypothesis is true for policies, we would see a 0 effect here. And this is exactly what we find. There's no impact of how many populist departments there are in a government and the likelihood that a law is repealed. Actually, if we look at the migration populism interaction effect, we even see a negative effect here. I wouldn't overinterpret this. It's only a very tiny effect and slightly significant. But it really shows that there seems to be that the populists and government in Austria seem to have been tamed considering policies. That's quite, of course, quite important. We can only speak about that here. And they did not decide on more unconstitutional policies than governments without populist participation. We can also see this in this marginal effect plot, which is really steady. It's just below 0, and the 95% confidence interval always includes the 0. So there's really no effect of the share of populist ministers here on the probability of a repeal. So what do we conclude from this? We read this as support for the inclusion moderation hypothesis when it comes to policies. And that, of course, is an argument that's very important to us, that it's really important to distinguish between manifestos, rhetoric, and policies, because the mechanism just works very different depending on what we're looking at. We think it would be really interesting if we saw some more research on policies for other cases, because of course we're just looking at Austria now, and it would be great to see some more cases here and whether we find a similar pattern. And it would be really interesting to see whether maybe constitutional transgressions by populists are more severe. This is something, of course, we're not accounting for with our dummy variable. And it would be really interesting to see whether there maybe is a difference there. Further, we try to bridge the gap between judicial politics and populism studies. And we think that's a a new area with growing contributions. And I think it's two research areas that could really well learn from each other. So we're hoping to see more empirical studies in these areas as well soon, because most of it is theoretical so far, and we think there's a lot to do there that we could learn. Thank you so much for listening. I'm really looking forward to your comments and questions, and to Michael's presentation next.
All right, thank you so much, Jasmin. This is super interesting, really, really cool stuff. And I think a lot to discuss. I mean, I have some questions, but we do that after Micha's presentation. Micha, I want to invite you to open your camera and share your screen. Exactly. Let me see. That works. If you also open your video, then you'll have a face to the world as well.
Okay. I just have to find out where I can activate my camera. Okay.
Should be exactly. Okay. Yeah. Great.
All right.
I'm going to turn off my camera again. So just like Jasmin, you'll be talking into the void, but don't worry. Plenty of us are here. So
okay.
Go ahead.
So thank you.
Yeah, sorry. I just wanted to add, Robert Huber will do the moderation after your presentation. So just for the record. All right. Sorry. Now the floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you so much for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to be here. And yeah, what I'm going to present is a paper which is joint work with Marcel Lewandowski from the University of Florida. And as you can see, it's entitled "Sympathy for the Devil: Voter Support for Illiberal Politicians." So what we're interested in is, of course, the observation that we have an increasing success of illiberal politicians or parties, which in most cases also includes, of course, populist actors. And you can see some of these examples here. Now, the puzzling question is that when we look at survey data on support for democracy in general and so on, we see that these numbers are maybe slightly declining in some cases, but in general, they are at a very high level. And at the same time, we see support for politicians who actively oppose basic principles of democracy. And therefore, there's this very fundamental questions: why do voters support such politicians or parties? And one argument that has been recently formulated quite prominently, especially in an APSR paper by Graham and Slolik, but also in various other papers, is basically a trade-off argument, which rests on the assumption that voters do not vote for such politicians or parties because they have a preference for illiberalism. So the assumption is voters do not like these illiberal attitudes, basically. However, some voters, at least, like other policies that these illiberal politicians and voters offer to them. In case of populist radical right parties, this is most often something with regard to migration and so on, but not necessarily illiberalism with regard to democratic reforms. These voters then face a trade-off between certain policies, and one could also say partisan preferences when we want to focus more on like party loyalties and so on. And on the other hand, their own preferences for or against illiberal democracy. So a voter has to decide what does she or he want, support an illiberal politician who fulfills their other policy preferences, or to support a liberal politician who has some other policy preferences. And the argument then is basically that when the policy congruence with the illiberal politician is strong enough, and then it can compensate for these illiberal attitudes, and the voter is willing to turn a blind eye on the illiberalism, basically, and say, okay, I'll still vote for the illiberal candidate because he or she fulfills my policy preferences so well. And what also follows from that is that the stronger voters care about liberal democracy, then of course the level of policy congruence with the illiberal candidate has to increase as well in order to have this compensating effect. Now, what follows from that is the question which factors basically affect whether a voter has a strong or rather weak preference for liberal democracy, because we can expect that these preferences for liberal democracy vary between voters. And in our paper, we focus on two potential explanations which might affect these levels. And the first is populism, which I guess to the audience is a quite obvious predictor in this case, because all the modern definitions of populism and so on basically imply that populist attitudes are in conflict with the very fundamental principles of liberal democracy. And the second set of attitudes that we look at is authoritarianism. And I think it's also quite clear how and why this relate to liberal democracy. And I think what is more important to discuss here is that we actually consider authoritarianism not just to be a subdimension of populism, which sometimes, maybe not in the specific literature on populism, but I think in the broader reception of illiberalism and all these buzzwords together are assumed to be the same concept, probably also because authoritarian populism is such a huge thing nowadays. However, we think these are different theoretical concepts, especially at the individual level. And in this regard, it's also noteworthy to say that in our data, we find no correlation between populist attitudes and authoritarian attitudes, for example. So this maybe already provides some evidence that these are some independent concepts that we measure here. Now, based on these theoretical assumptions, we derive three hypotheses. And the first one directly follows from this trade-off argument. That is, the higher the policy congruence with an illiberal candidate, then a voter is more likely to support an illiberal politician. And the second and third hypothesis are basically interaction effects, which say that this first hypothesis is stronger for voters with a high level of authoritarian attitudes, and the next hypothesis identical just for populist attitudes. Now, how do we test these hypotheses? We rely on a choice experiment, which has several similarities to a conjoint experiment, which is probably well known. We conducted this in Germany. We have a sample size of 1,000 voters, and this was provided by the company Respondi. So this is rather high quality sample. It's not just any convenience sample. And we conducted this in June 2021. And we also pre-registered the main parts of this paper. Now, how does the experiment look like? As I said, it closely resembles standard conjoint experiments. There's just one important difference. So we have two politicians, and we have a respondent who has to make a decision, which of the two politicians do you want or would you prefer? And these politicians have different attributes, which we randomly vary. We have gender and age, just for providing a complete picture of the politician. But more importantly, we have 4 policy positions on income tax, unemployment subsidies, and so on. And there they can take random positions, either a left wing, right wing, or status quo position. And here are some examples. And we also asked the respondents about their preferences on these policy positions in advance, so that we can measure the congruence with each of both politicians. Now, what makes this different from standard conjoint experiments is that we have an additional set of attributes in which we provide information about a politician's stance on liberal democracy. And here it is the case that one politician is always supportive of liberal democracy and the other one is always illiberal. So they are not fully randomized. And when the one is illiberal, the other has to be liberal, and vice versa. Now, what does this allow us? Of course, then the respondent can make a decision, but essentially the experiment is designed in such a way that the respondent has to do a choice between illiberalism and liberalism, and policy congruence is not correlated with positions on illiberalism and liberalism. Now, how do we induce these illiberal attitudes? We say that there are 3 dimensions, like independence of public broadcasting company, the selection of judges for the Constitutional Court, and also the legislative power for the executive, where the one candidate takes the liberal and the other one takes always illiberal positions on these. Now, this is how it looked like. I'll just skip that. And our dependent variable is whether the illiberal politician was selected in the experiment, and it's the dummy variable. Our main independent variable is the relative policy congruence between a voter and the illiberal politician. And we measure that on a scale from -2 to +2, where 0 means that the policy congruence with the liberal and the illiberal politician is at the same level. -2 means the liberal candidate has a clear policy advantage over the illiberal candidate, and +2 means that the voter has a very high congruence with the illiberal candidate and no congruence with the liberal candidate. And then we also measure populism based on the Ackermann scale with a range from 1 to 5, and authoritarianism based on the Nielsen scale, and also has a range from 1 to 5. Now, what are our results? So first of all, we have this direct effect of the policy advantage on voting for the illiberal candidate, and we find clear evidence that this plays a role. So when you look at the 0 line on the x-axis, this means that both politicians have the same degree of policy congruence with the voter, and then it's really unlikely that a voter selects the illiberal politician, but it strongly increases when the illiberal politician has a policy advantage over the liberal candidate. So there the probability increases up to more than 75%. Now, when we interact this with populism, we find clear differences between populist and non-populist voters, as you can see here. So the purple lines are the simulations for the results for non-populist voters, and there we can see that the probability is much lower. And for the populist respondents, we see that the probability increases much stronger and faster, and that the overall probability of supporting the illiberal candidate is much higher. And we actually find basically the same pattern for authoritarian respondents. Now, because my time is over, we have some additional findings that the three-way interaction where the results are a bit unstable, but only increase when authoritarianism and populism are high. And what we also find is that left-right ideology has no effect, and also satisfaction with democracy basically has no effect on the results. So to summarize our findings, we can see that in fact, most voters support illiberal politicians despite of their stance on democracy, but we also find that populism and authoritarianism has, that these voters are more likely to support illiberalism. And overall, these results are quite worrisome, like the other studies have already shown, because the support for liberal democracy seems to be highly conditional. Thank you so much for your attention. I'm looking forward to the Q&A.
Excellent. Many thanks, Jasmin and Michael, for those presentations and the very nice papers. So
Robert, you've muted yourself, I think.
Shoot. Okay, cheers. So thanks for the presentations. Don't know what happened there. So let's open the floor for the Q&A, and let's see. You can either use the raise your hand function to signal that you would like to say something, and I can allow you to say something then. But you can also use the Q&A function to type a question. So let me give you a second to open, to write a question, to ask something. I already received one or two. Okay, then maybe let me start with, do you have a question, Moritz?
Yeah, actually, I do have a question. So first for Jasmin, thanks for this paper. I think this is really, really interesting. And I also share your thoughts that it's important to measure the effects of populist rule and not just their communication. And I think that's really important. So my question here is twofold. First of all, theoretically, so is it really populism in theory that would kind of constrain or lead to these unconstitutional, in theory, right, unconstitutional legislations or laws, or is it more related to nativism and authoritarianism? Slightly related maybe to Micha's paper. And another kind of conclusion of the paper, but also kind of theoretical conclusion, is that they're tamed. But then the question I would have is tamed by whom? So are they tamed by their coalition partners, or maybe by the institutional context, which is of course hard to spell out, but maybe you have some ideas about it. And then I was wondering, with empirically, so what kind of laws are repealed? Like, can you give us some kind of insight into, okay, maybe the Constitutional Court always has this very technical, you made some formal mistakes and that's why we repealed, or is it also sometimes really based on substantive content? Because if that's the case, if it's the latter, then your null finding obviously becomes more relevant. Yeah, and I'll leave it at that. I have some questions for Micha, but I might ask them later.
Yeah, thank you so much for these great questions. Yeah, I think it's populism and nativism. I don't think we can exactly differentiate which one drives the illiberal laws that they might decide upon. I think on the policy, if we look at what policies motivate them, it's probably rather the nativism. But if we look at what kind of idea of democracy lies behind that, why do they not have an incentive to comply with the Constitution because they simply don't share how the constitutional system works, then it's rather the populism. So I guess in the end, it's an interaction between both. So they have to have some nativist kind of policy preferences, and then there needs to be this populist ideal of democracy, or it could probably also be an authoritarian idea about democracy. I'm not sure about that. I haven't thought that through. So yeah, I think both have to be there, but that's true. That might be a point that we might make stronger, that policies, that this is really based on a nativist argument there. Yeah, the question, are they tamed by whom? That's a question we make way stronger in the paper and not so much in the presentation today. We argue that they are tamed by the coalition partner. And I think actually Austria, again, is a very interesting example for this, because we've seen a very strong FPÖ government in Carinthia, so in one of the regions. And there, where they were pretty much by themselves in office. They didn't have the full majority. It was still like 44% or something, but they didn't have constraints from any coalition partner really. And there they did not back down. They did, that's the example, Ortstafelstreit. I had it on a slide, but I didn't actually talk about it because it's always a long story. But pretty much the outcome is they didn't just ignore the constitution, that they also ignored what the Constitutional Court told them to do. And it ended up in like an 8-year-long fight about whether to put up bilingual signs or not. And the Constitutional Court was called like a carnival joke and things like that. So I think this really shows that when they were alone in office, they did put through their preferences. But when their coalition partner was very, really looked at what they're doing and just didn't decide on unconstitutional policies with them, then that's the effect we see. And what kind of laws are repealed? It's actually the Constitutional Court in Austria is quite an active one. They don't just look at procedural questions, they really look at contents as well. And you can really see them as a policy maker as well in part. So it would be, for example, they would decide a lot on whether you could take social rights away from migrants. That would be a classical example where the FPÖ government, again, so in 2003, 2005, and again, now when they were in government with courts together, where they try to restrict social rights of asylum seekers, take away their possibilities to get benefits. And that's something, for example, that would be like a prime example where they repealed laws by populist governments. Thank you so much.
Excellent. So we have one question from the audience and one from Michael. If this is okay for you, Michael, I would give the floor to the audience first. Paulus, you should be able to open your mic now and pose your question.
Bonjour, my name is As Paulus, I hope you can hear me, and thank you for this highly interesting papers. I have one question to each presenter. Both are of theoretical kind. Jasmin, I feel that the focus on unconstitutional policies has an implication about populist impact on democracy. It may be possible to pass radical policies or even such who negatively impact democratic institutions under a given constitution. To what degree do you look at this, not look at it? Also, why or why not? And then, Michael, thank you very much for this highly interesting paper as well. I feel up to a certain point you tell a very straightforward story, which is voters care about policy content and they are willing to accept illiberal politicians if they are closest to them. But then there's also this other finding of yours, which is that illiberal voters actively demand illiberal politicians. So how does this fit into this theoretical buildup of your thesis? Is illiberalism just an issue? I mean, you say populism and authoritarianism, but it comes down to something very similar, is it not? Is it just an issue like any other in the end? Or how do you theorize on this? Thank you very much.
Thank you for your question. Jasmin, you want to give a short answer first before we hand over to Michael, and then Michael can ask his question as well, and I have plenty too.
Yeah, we don't account for this at all, to be honest. We just, if we consider something, if it's constitutional, it's democratic. If it's not constitutional, it's not democratic. But I do agree with you that you could do something undemocratic under a constitution as well. Of course, very much depends on the constitution. That's what I said in the end, that I think it would be very interesting to account for the severity of the violations. I'm still looking for a way to measure that. So if any of you have a great idea how to measure that in judicial decisions, let me know. I'd be very interested to hear about that. So yeah, we're working on that.
Thank you. Michael?
First of all, I think I start with responding to the question by Paulus, and then I also have a question to Jasmin, actually. So first, my response to Paulus. Thank you very much for the question. I think it helps us clarifying what the actual story is and what our contribution is here. And I think there are two potential answers to your question, as far as if I correctly understood. The one is, I think we certainly lack at an attitudinal level studies which really show that populism, for example, or that populist voters have actually preference for illiberalism, or at least care less about liberal democracy, because empirically how we measure populist attitudes, it's not very straightforward connected to liberal democracy. With, of course, from a theoretical perspective, from an expert political science perspective, we know that these items that we ask in surveys, for example, are somehow in conflict with liberal democracy. But from a lay citizen's perspective, I don't think that this is actually the case, that when you ask, like, should the people have more power, that this might be in conflict with liberal democracy, to put it very bluntly, right? And actually asking directly, like, how much do you support liberal democracy, is also a bit too blunt and potentially induce the social desirability bias. So this is one way how we thought about it, and think that this way how we operationalize this in this experimental setup is a way to measure support for liberal democracy more general, regardless of the specific candidate choice experiment. And the other question is more like, is there really a preference for liberalism, or is it just the cost of policy congruence that they care less about? So when we have this negative policy congruence with the illiberal candidate, so where do they still vote for the illiberal candidate? And I think this is something we can also address, and we find that they are not really willing to vote for an illiberal candidate. So it is first the policy congruence, and then it's the liberal democracy attitude, what we can show. I think this is what we can contribute with it. Now my question to Jasmin is, so we know that, and I think you also said it a few minutes ago, that constitutional courts can be political actors. And I wondered whether opposition parties are using the Constitutional Court as a political actor more frequently when populists are in government. Now, why I'm asking this is because this might have also implications for your dependent variable, because currently uses 0-1 coding, which basically is the same as using the share of repeals, basically, right? Just as a when you aggregate it. However, when the opposition is using the constitutional codes more frequently when populists are in government, then the absolute number of repeals could increase while the share remains the same. So it might also be, at least as a robustness check, a good way to use like the count as a dependent variable. And my question is basically, did you thought about that? It's a stupid thought and so on. Right?
Yeah, thank you so much. That's a very good point. We did think about that, and we were super surprised the opposition does not use it more often. It's very fascinating because that's also something you read quite a bit that they do. But there was actually no difference. I have a graph with me, which I could share really quickly, where you see quite easily that I hope you can see it now, that there's not really a difference between non-populist and populist governments. Their laws are reviewed roughly about the same, just as often, and they're also sued roughly the same time. It differs a bit by the policy area, but in general, there's no significant difference. If you run a t-test with it, there's no significant difference. And that's really, to be honest, that was super surprising to us as well. So yeah, thank you so much, though. It was, I was hoping I could share the slide.
Excellent. So there are a couple questions in the chat. Let me just briefly state them. There is one for Michael and one for Jasmin, and then I have two that Annika asked me to ask you as well. So in the chat, the first question is about the number of repeals related to the support that populist radical right parties have. So not only whether they're in government or not, but also to what extent are they strong, whatever the potential operationalization could be here, right? So if we think of the FPÖ early on in the first Schüssel government, they were really strong, then they were really weak in the second. Do we see a shift here or not? So that's a question for you. And then there's a question for Michael about the inclusion of party affiliation in the candidate profiles, and whether there is also heterogeneity between party preferences according to your data. So maybe Jasmin, do you want to go first and then?
All right. Yeah, thank you so much for this question. We don't see an effect of the strength while they're in government, but we don't control for the strength if they're not in government. So we don't control for whether they had a high vote share or not. So to be honest, I can't tell you anything whether that has an effect, but that would be something that would be interesting to look at. And you also asked whether these, whether overly strong courts undermine incumbents and therefore strengthen radical right parties. To be honest, I think that would be a whole new paper. It's a really interesting thought, but I can't tell you anything on it because I haven't thought this through. And I also don't know any paper that would have evidence on this so far. So you might have a nice idea there that would be really interesting to look at.
Just there is this interesting research by Joost van Spanje who shows that when the radical right is being persecuted for hate speech or things like that, that is often actually boosts their support. And so there is some research on that, but that's a bit of a different track, but maybe just for reference. So check that out if you're interested.
Excellent. Do you want to respond to your questions, Michael?
Yeah, sure. So regarding the first question, whether we included party affiliation in the candidate profiles, the answer is no, which is, I think, or a debate where I would like to see more progress in methodological terms and like what kind of effect does it have in these candidate choice experiments that are so common nowadays in political science research. Because we know that party labels are such a strong predictor for vote choice, but on the other hand, it is nearly impossible to include any policy positions without running into like really strange profiles where you have a pro-migration, pro-climate change, radical right party member, and that's why I think it is common practice to avoid having party labeled. But I fully, if this is the intention of the question, I would fully agree that this is of course a trade-off in methodological terms that we always have to take. And I currently don't know what to do about that. So I have another conjoint experiment where I actually randomly varied whether these party labels are included or not, and the results were that it doesn't have such a huge impact on the other effects. So it seems to be rather independent of that. But yeah, that's just one current paper. And with regard to the second question of unfortunately, I haven't prepared the slide as Jasmin did, but yeah, we did that. We interacted also with vote choice and party preference, and basically the same as we have with left-right orientation and satisfaction with democracy. It doesn't really affect our results. Like, there are very small differences, but not even in the direction that we would expect. That, for example, the AfD voters have a higher preference for liberal candidates. So that's also something that surprised a little bit, but maybe it's evidence that it's more about really the attitudes that people have, and not so much about which party they vote for.
Thanks. May I follow up here with one of the questions that Annika sent me in the chat? Do you think there is a chance that respondents infer party positions based on the policy positions you assign them? And what would this do with your result, right? So if you present somebody who is very skeptical on immigration, etc., then people would think, oh, that's an AfD candidate. Does it make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. I'm just wondering whether whether this introduces any bias, because if that's the case, then it wouldn't no longer be the actual policy congruence that we measure. It's rather the assumed partisanship, and then our story basically flips from, okay, it's direct policy congruence, to respondents are willing to trade off assumed partisanship against liberal democracy, which of course would be a different mechanism somehow, but it would still support, I think, the main line of reasoning in the paper, that people are willing to do a trade-off here, and then it would be okay, they guess the party label, maybe correctly, maybe incorrectly, they don't know. And I think what speaks a bit against it is that we don't have this interaction with the party labels so much, because for a Green voter or SPD voter, or like a centrist party, it is really complicated to predict based on these 4 policy dimensions that we have the correct party label, right? They maybe can exclude something like, okay, this is very unlikely to be a member of the Greens or something due to the climate change issue. But I think if it's really the case, then we would probably see a strong correlation with vote choice. Yeah, but I mean, ultimately we cannot say it, but it is a potential mechanism. Yeah.
Absolutely, thanks a lot. Moritz, do you want to ask your question?
Thanks. I have a question also for Michael. So first, I was wondering, or actually, maybe more of a comment than a question. So I think when you, I think your measure and your study design is really nice, and congratulations. What I think is if you, because you use basically observed, it's not just all experimentally manipulated data, you also use observed data, right? So to make your congruence variable, you measure pre-treatment what the positions of the respondents are. And I think for the design and purpose of your study, that's totally valid. But I do think it kind of brings your experimental study also to the observational realm, so to speak. So I think it would be good to include, or maybe you did this in the appendix or in the actual paper, but it would be good to include controls for age, education, just the whole shebang, basically, because because I think otherwise you might get biased results. Maybe maybe in the end it's unwarranted, but I think this is also something that could come up in the review process. And then my other question is kind of twofold: theoretical but also methodological. So how does your paper, because I think it's really well crafted and the results look really, really interesting, but how does it differ or add to what we've read from Graham and Svolek? Is it a repetition for German context, or what is your selling point? Because I think this is a really nice experiment, and sometimes I see these really great experiments, depending on how they're framed, in the top journal, or in a good let's say sub-top journal. So if you're FC Bayern Munich, or rather, I don't know, Wolfsburg or anything like that, right? So I was wondering, what is your selling point there? And then I was also wondering, because I was interested in this choice experiment with the idea that you always you do not randomize whether they're illiberal or liberal, so that you keep that fixed. And why is that the case? And why would you argue that is a better way of getting at the unique effect of liberalism, illiberalism? Because I'd be interested to hear that. And maybe that's also something maybe that also adds to your contribution in a sense, right?
Okay, lots of points being raised. So first of all, on your comment on including controls, something I agree on. I think there's already a high level of randomization, because it's just one side which is observational, and the congruence is still randomized because one level of randomization is enough. But still, I see a point, and think it makes sense to add, at least as a robustness check, controls and so on. And now to the other points, like what do we add, and are we going to the Champions League with this, or just the Bundesliga? Well, as someone from Lower Saxony, I'm quite used not to play in the Champions League, and Wolfsburg has a high level of sympathy for me. But more seriously speaking, of course, this has a high degree of similarity with what Graham and Svolek have done, and we are not trying to sell this as the new innovative stuff that we invented. The experimental design is deliberately chosen like or similar to them, and we also, as you've seen, from theoretical terms, we rely on their work. Now, I think what the major contribution here is to say that the effect that Graham and Svolek found for the US context can be, first of all, that's a contribution in its own, but it's not how we try to sell it in a different context, maybe in a very different historical and so on context, PR and all the stuff in Germany. But so replication. But I think the more important point here is like to say, pay attention to the moderators and pay attention to populism, to authoritarianism, that these attitudes are really relevant in this whole debate. So this can speak to debates about polarization between voters with different attitudes and so on. And I think this is a smaller contribution, but I would say, to promote my paper, a very fine addition. So it adds an important new dimension to what Graham and Svolek have found. And maybe we have to do a slightly better job in selling this more actively and focusing more on this aspect. But I think this is currently lacking in the literature, which I think mostly focuses on saying, yeah, we have this trade-off and we find always evidence for this trade-off. And now more in regarding the methodological questions that you have, like, I like this idea of having this like one attribute which is rather fixed and not fully randomized, because basically you lose 50% of your observations when you also randomize this, because when both are illiberal or both are liberal, you can't say anything about it because it can not have an impact, because both have the same same outcome there, right? So it's not useful. You just lose observations when you want to focus on that. And I think therefore it is advisable to do that. But of course, it's a deviation from the Heimler 2014 blueprint paper on how to conduct a conjoint experiment, right? But I think that this like focus on this one approach how to do it is now weakening, and that we can have a bit more leeway in how to design choice experiment and derive this different estimates, which are also of interest. Therefore, I think it is justified, but more, or let's say I would be interested in seeing more methodologically solid elaboration of what the estimate is here and so on. And maybe there are some methodological pitfalls that I don't see currently, but yeah, in general, I think this is quite a promising approach for addressing such questions.
Thank you for your response to those questions. So I don't see any further questions in the chat or the Q&A, or no raised hands. So I have a couple smaller questions for Jasmin, and then we'll see where we stand. And let me start by a question. This is 50% Annika's questions and 50% my own thoughts, so a tribute whether you like it or not, depending. Right. So if we think of junior parties in coalition, they do not act in a void, right? They interact with another partner. And if we compare the Austrian Freedom Party under Schüssel to the Austrian People's Party under Schüssel to the Austrian People's Party under Kurz, we see stark differences, particularly on how much they were willing to accept liberal democracy, right? Even like the Minister of the Constitutional Affairs in Austria, Caroline Edstadler, was very open about, well, constitution is just a piece of paper. We have to govern, and then let's see how it goes. And I mean, Kurz was talking about like tiny details that make the Constitutional Court destroy his outstanding work and so on, right? So the tone has dramatically changed. And so to what extent do we have to extend this to this new type of conservative party, if you want, like Kurz or like Johnson elsewhere? And to what extent are those two actors independent? Let me also add one question that I had myself is, what's the role of politics in here, right? So if we take the Ortstafelstreit, right? So what happened there, just to give some context to those who are not familiar, somebody representing Slovenian minorities drove into a village too fast, got a ticket for that, and said, well, there is no bilingual title on the Ortstafel, on the sign that says municipality is starting here, so I didn't know I had to slow down. And clearly there was a political motivation to getting this all started and getting the whole process up to the Constitutional Court, right? And we can anticipate that different parties, but also different societal actors may do this depending on what issue we're talking about, right? We could even think that the target for populist parties changes depending on what their role is, right? If they're in opposition, they may attack the national institutions more, but when they're in government and they see that the European Court is, for example, limiting them, they may shift their focus here. Do you have some evidence to enlighten us in these dimensions as well?
Yeah, thank you so much. I'll start with the last question because I don't think I have too much evidence on that. I think what we thought about most was that we made sure that there is like no large differences, no significant differences in whether they were sued. So we don't see any judicial activism or some kind of strategic litigation when populists are in office. And it's kind of hard to get information on when the populist, so when the FPÖ is the one going to court, because they can do this quite easily, of course, since they are in quite a few regional parts in parliaments quite strongly, and then they're in the Nationalrat. So of course they have possibilities there, but only if they do it on the official way via an abstract norm control. Is that included in the decision text? So only then does it say, okay, and the plaintiffs were politicians from the FPÖ. So it's kind of hard to see when they sue. That would be really interesting to do. But it's the same problem in Germany. I've been trying to find out who's when they are going to court here, and it's really tough to find data on that. So unfortunately, I can't enlighten you so far. And now about your first question. Yeah, it's totally true. It's that it has very much changed how the discourse is and what the Conservative Party is saying. We controlled for this by excluding and including the government. So we've excluded the Kurz government also because, of course, it's only quite a short time frame since they've left office. And of course, it takes time for these complaints to come in, to process them, and to actually decide. So I think it will be really interesting. We should do this analysis again in 5 years and then see whether we do see a difference between the Kurz government and the other FPÖ governments. We did the same as well with the FPÖ government in the 80s, because of course then the FPÖ was very liberal, and you could think that they didn't have any incentives for them to go beyond constitutional boundaries. But never mind who we exclude, we always find the same effect. There's just nothing there. So it's very robust, but it would be really interesting to see in a couple of years whether that's still the same with the Kurz government, because I mean, it was a short but very intense time, I guess.